On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, Nazi Germany launched its invasion of Poland. German bombers filled the skies, and tanks rolled across the border in what would become known as the Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. The Weissmann family, like millions of Poles, woke to the sound of explosions and the terrifying reality that war had come to their doorstep. Gerda was 15 years old, just months past her 15th birthday. The family gathered around their radio, listening in horror as reports came in of German forces advancing rapidly through Polish defences. Julius Weissmann's face grew grave as he absorbed the news. He turned to his family and spoke words that Gerda would never forget. The good times are over. Within days, the German military machine demonstrated its overwhelming power. The Polish army, though brave and determined, was no match for the modernized German forces. Bielsko, located in southern Poland, near the border with Czechoslovakia, which Germany had already occupied earlier that year, was quickly in the path of the invasion. The town's residents could hear the sounds of warfare drawing closer. By early September, German troops entered Bielsko. The occupation began immediately. Nazi flags with swastikas were hung from public buildings. German soldiers patrolled the streets. The town that Gerda had known her entire life suddenly felt foreign and threatening. The occupying forces established military control and began implementing the Nazi administrative structure. Almost immediately, the persecution of Jews began. The Nazis had years of experience in Germany and Austria perfecting their methods of isolating and controlling Jewish populations, and they brought these techniques to occupied Poland with brutal efficiency. The restrictions came in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Within the first weeks, Jewish businesses were marked. Stormtroopers and local collaborators painted Stars of David and the word Jude on shop windows. Julius Weissmann's textile business, which he had built over decades, was seized. German authorities simply walked in and took control, declaring that Jews could no longer own businesses. The family's primary source of income vanished overnight. Julius, a man who had taken pride in his work and his ability to provide for his family, was suddenly stripped of his livelihood and purpose. Jewish children were expelled from public schools. Gerda and her friends found themselves forbidden from attending classes with their non-Jewish peers. The friendships she had cultivated throughout her childhood began to fray as the Nazi ideology of racial separation was enforced. Some of her non-Jewish friends remained loyal, meeting her in secret, but others turned away, whether from fear, indifference, or, in some cases, embracing the anti-Semitic propaganda that the Nazis spread relentlessly. The Nazis required all Jews over the age of 12 to wear identifying armbands with the Star of David. Later, this was changed to a yellow star that had to be sewn onto clothing, worn on both the front and back. This visible marking made every Jew instantly identifiable and vulnerable. Gerda had to wear the star whenever she left her home, branding her as someone separate, someone less than human in the eyes of the Nazi regime. Public spaces were systematically closed to Jews. Parks where Gerda had played as a child now bore signs reading Juden verboten, Jews forbidden. Jews could not enter cinemas, theatres, cafes or restaurants. They were prohibited from using public transportation. Curfews were imposed. Jews had to be in their homes by certain hours or risk arrest. The simple freedoms of daily life that Gerda had taken for granted disappeared. Food rationing was implemented, but Jews received significantly smaller rations than non-Jews. The Weissmann family, like all Jewish families, found themselves struggling to obtain enough food to survive. The calories allotted to Jews were deliberately insufficient to maintain health. This was not merely neglect. It was a calculated policy designed to weaken and ultimately destroy the Jewish population through starvation. The Nazis also implemented financial restrictions. Jewish bank accounts were frozen or confiscated. Families were forbidden from possessing more than minimal amounts of cash. Any valuable items, jewelry, artwork, silverware, had to be surrendered to German authorities. The Weissmann family watched as their possessions, accumulated over generations, were taken from them piece by piece. Then came one of the most humiliating measures: the forced relocation within their own home. German officers selected the Weissmann house for their own use. The family was ordered to vacate the upper floors and move into the basement. Gerda, her parents, and Arthur had to compress their entire lives into a few small, dark rooms below ground level, while Nazi officers lived in the comfortable rooms above them. Living in the basement of their own home was a daily exercise in degradation. They could hear the Germans walking on the floors above them, living in their space, using their furniture, sleeping in their beds. The family had to be quiet, invisible, constantly aware of the hostile presence just feet away. They had to ask permission for basic things, had to endure inspections and intrusions at any hour. Their home, once a place of warmth and security, became a prison. The psychological impact was devastating. Julius Weissmann, once a proud and successful businessman, was reduced to helplessness. He could not protect his family or provide for them in the ways he had always done. Helene tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, preparing meals from their meager rations, keeping the cramped basement space clean, encouraging her children. But the strain showed on everyone. Arthur, now in his early 20s, faced the particular anguish of a young man whose future had been stolen. He should have been starting his career, perhaps courting a young woman, building his own life. Instead, he was trapped, watching his family suffer, unable to do anything about it. Gerda witnessed the transformation of her parents from confident, happy people into frightened, diminished versions of themselves. She saw her father's shoulders slump, heard her mother crying quietly when she thought no one was listening. The girl, who had worried about dresses and dances, now worried about survival. The Nazi occupiers also began public demonstrations of cruelty designed to terrorize the Jewish population. Jews were pulled from their homes and forced to perform humiliating tasks, scrubbing streets with toothbrushes while crowds of Germans laughed, having their beards forcibly cut or torn out, being made to exercise or perform degrading acts for the amusement of soldiers. These public humiliations served to dehumanize Jews in the eyes of both the perpetrators and the witnesses. Random violence became commonplace. Jews could be beaten on the street for no reason, or for minor infractions like failing to step off the sidewalk quickly enough. When a German approached, there was no legal recourse, no protection. The police, now under German control, offered no help to Jewish victims. In fact, they often participated in the persecution. The Weissmann family also faced the anguish of losing contact with extended family members. Communication became difficult and then impossible. Relatives in other towns and cities faced similar or worse conditions. Letters were censored or never arrived. The family network that had provided support and connection for generations was fractured. Religious life was also under attack. Synagogues were destroyed or confiscated. Religious Jews were targeted for particular abuse. their traditional clothing and appearance making them easily identifiable. Jewish holidays and observances became dangerous to practice openly. The Nazis sought not just to control Jews, but to eradicate Jewish culture and faith entirely. For 3 long years, from 1939 to 1942, the Weissmann family endured this steadily worsening nightmare. Each month brought new restrictions, new cruelties, new losses. They lived in constant fear, never knowing what the next day would bring. They heard rumors from other occupied territories about mass killings, about camps, about entire Jewish communities disappearing. But the full scope of the Holocaust was not yet clear to them. The family clung to hope. They hoped the war would end soon. They hoped that the Allies would defeat Germany. They hoped that somehow they would survive until liberation came. Julius tried to maintain his dignity and protect his family as best he could. Helene focused on keeping everyone fed and together. Arthur and Gerda supported each other as siblings, finding small moments of normalcy in the horror. But in 1942, the situation became catastrophically worse. The Nazis began implementing the final solution, the systematic murder of all European Jews. In occupied Poland, this meant the liquidation of Jewish communities through deportation to death camps. The Weissmann family's worst fears were about to be realized. The terror of those 3 years of occupation had been devastating, but it was only the beginning of Gerda's ordeal. The deportations that would tear her family apart forever were about to begin. The spring of 1942 brought a new and horrifying phase of Nazi persecution. Throughout occupied Poland, the Germans began implementing what they called resettlement actions, a euphemism for the systematic deportation of Jews to concentration and extermination camps. In Bielsko, as in countless other towns and cities, the Jewish community faced its darkest hour. Rumors had been circulating for months about what was happening in other parts of Poland. Whispers spoke of entire Jewish communities being rounded up and transported away in cattle cars. Some said they were being sent to labor camps in the east. Others spoke of mass killings. The truth was difficult to discern amid the fear and confusion. But one thing was clear. Deportation meant almost certain death, even if the exact nature of that death remained unclear. The Nazis used deception as part of their strategy. They told Jews they were being relocated for work assignments. They instructed deportees to bring luggage and personal belongings, maintaining the fiction that they were simply moving to another location. This lie was designed to prevent panic and resistance, making the deportations easier to carry out. In Bielsko, the SS and German police, assisted by local collaborators, began organizing the deportations in early 1942. Lists were compiled of Jewish residents. The Gestapo established a system of control, using the Jewish Council, a group of Jewish leaders forced to serve as intermediaries between the Nazi authorities and the Jewish population, to communicate orders and facilitate the roundups. Arthur Weissmann was among the first wave of young Jewish men taken from Bielsko. He was 20 years old, strong and healthy, exactly the type the Nazis claimed they needed for labor. The selection of young men first was strategic. It removed those most capable of resistance and broke the morale of families left behind. When the Nazi officers came for Arthur, the family had only minutes to say goodbye. There was no time to prepare, no time to process what was happening. The moment every family in the ghetto had been dreading had arrived at the Weissmann home. Arthur stood in the cramped basement that had become their prison, facing his parents and sister, knowing this might be the last time they would ever see each other. Helene, despite her own terror and grief, tried to be practical. She insisted that Arthur take his good boots, sturdy, well-made boots that would protect his feet. In that moment, she was still a mother, still trying to care for her son in whatever small way she could. She told him he would need them, that he must take care of himself, that he must be strong. These were the last words she ever spoke to her son. Julius embraced Arthur, trying to give him courage, while his own heart was breaking. The father, who had always been able to fix problems, to provide solutions, could do nothing now but let his son go. Gerda watched her brother, her companion through childhood, her protector, her rival, her friend, walk away. The image of Arthur standing in the doorway, wearing those boots their mother had insisted upon, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Arthur was taken to the Sosnowitz ghetto initially, and from there he was deported to a labor camp. The exact details of his fate remain uncertain, lost in the chaos and systematic destruction of records that characterized the Holocaust. What is known is that Arthur Weissmann did not survive. Whether he died from the brutal labor conditions, from disease, from starvation, or from execution, his family never learned. He simply vanished into the machinery of genocide, one of 6 million Jewish lives extinguished. For 3 weeks after Arthur's deportation, the Weissmann family lived in agonizing uncertainty. They had no information about where he had been taken or what had happened to him. Every day they hoped for news, for some sign that he was alive. But no news came. The silence was its own form of torture. Then, on June 28, 1942, the Nazi officers came for Julius and Helene. It was a date seared into Gerda's memory forever. The deportation orders were brutally efficient. Certain houses, certain families would be taken on certain days. There was a cold, bureaucratic precision to the genocide. When the knock came on the door, the family knew what it meant. There was no possibility of hiding, no possibility of escape. The basement where they lived offered no sanctuary. German soldiers and SS officers were everywhere, systematically going through the Jewish quarters, pulling people from their homes. Julius put on his hat, a small gesture of dignity in the face of absolute powerlessness. He was determined to maintain his humanity, to not give the Nazis the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Helene gathered what few belongings they were allowed to take. Their movements were those of people in shock, going through motions while their minds struggled to accept the reality of what was happening. Gerda stood watching her parents prepare to leave. She was 18 years old, and she was about to lose everything. The 3 of them had only moments together. There was so much to say and no time to say it. How do you say goodbye to your parents when you know you will never see them again? How do you compress a lifetime of love into a few final words? Helene kissed her daughter. She looked into Gerda's eyes and told her to be strong. It was an echo of what she had said to Arthur, a mother's last attempt to prepare her child for survival. Those 2 words, be strong, carried the weight of everything Helene wanted to say but couldn't. That she loved Gerda, that she believed in her, that she wanted her to live, to survive, to remember them. Julius looked at his daughter, his little girl, who had grown into a young woman. He could not protect her from what was coming. All his success, all his hard work, all his love meant nothing against the Nazi machinery of death. He had to leave her alone in a world that wanted to destroy her. Then they were gone. SSS guards forced them out of the basement, into the street where other Jewish families were being assembled. Gerda watched from the doorway as her parents joined the growing crowd of deportees. She saw her mother's back, her father's hat, and then they disappeared into the mass of humanity being herded toward the trains. The deportees were marched through the streets of Bielsko to the railway station. Neighbors and former friends watched from windows and doorways. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the scene but unwilling or unable to intervene. Others watched with indifference or even satisfaction, their humanity corrupted by years of Nazi propaganda. At the station, the deportees were forced into cattle cars, freight cars designed for animals, not humans. These cars had no seats, no toilets, no ventilation except for small barred windows. The Nazis packed people in so tightly that there was barely room to stand. Families with children, elderly people, the sick, all were crammed together in conditions of indescribable misery. The trains departed with their human cargo, heading east. Julius and Helene Weissmann were transported to a death camp, most likely Auschwitz, though the exact destination was not recorded with certainty. What is certain is that they were murdered shortly after arrival. Elderly deportees and those deemed unfit for labor were sent directly to the gas chambers upon arrival. They were likely killed within hours or days of leaving Bielsko. Gerda would not learn the specific details of her parents' deaths for years. During the war, she held on to hope that somehow they had survived, that perhaps they were in a labor camp somewhere, that when the war ended, she would find them. But after liberation, as the full truth of the Holocaust emerged, she came to understand that her parents had almost certainly been murdered immediately upon arrival at the death camp. The loss of her entire family within the span of a few weeks was devastating beyond measure. Gerda, at 18, was completely alone. The people who had loved her, protected her, and given her life were gone. The home she had known was gone. Her childhood, her security, her sense of identity, all had been stripped away. But Gerda herself was not deported with her parents. The Nazis had different plans for young, healthy Jews who could work. Gerda was categorized as fit for labor and was sent to a forced labor camp, rather than being sent directly to a death camp. This arbitrary decision, based on her age and physical condition, saved her life, at least temporarily. As Gerda was taken to the labor camp, she carried with her only the clothes on her back and the memories of her family. She held on to her mother's last words, "Be strong." She held on to the image of her father in his hat, maintaining his dignity. She held on to the memory of Arthur accepting those boots from their mother. These memories would become both her burden and her salvation. The burden of being the only one who remembered, the only one who could bear witness to the lives of Julius, Helene, and Arthur Weissmann, and the salvation of having something to live for, the responsibility to survive so that her family would not be completely erased from history. Gerda Weissmann was now prisoner number 29,539. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a sister. She was a number in the Nazi system of slave labor, and her real ordeal was just beginning. Gerda Weissmann arrived at her first forced labor camp in the summer of 1942, just weeks after losing her entire family. The camp was located in Borkenhain, a town in Lower Silesia that had been incorporated into the German Reich. She was transported there in a crowded cattle car along with dozens of other young Jewish women, all of whom had been deemed fit for work and therefore temporarily spared from immediate extermination. When the train doors opened, the women were confronted with their new reality. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers where armed guards constantly surveyed the prisoners. Searchlights swept across the grounds at night, and guard dogs patrolled the perimeter. Escape was virtually impossible. Those who tried were almost always caught and publicly executed as a warning to others. The arrival process was designed to strip away the last vestiges of the prisoners' humanity. Gerda and the other women were immediately subjected to a humiliating intake procedure. They were forced to undress completely in front of male and female guards, who searched them for any hidden valuables. Any remaining personal possessions, photographs, letters, small mementos, were confiscated and destroyed. The Nazis wanted the prisoners to have nothing that connected them to their former lives, nothing that reminded them they had once been human beings with families and identities. The women's heads were shaved. This was ostensibly done for hygiene purposes, to prevent lice, but it served a deeper purpose, to humiliate and dehumanize. Hair is tied to identity, to femininity, to dignity. Removing it was another way of stripping the prisoners of their sense of self. Gerda watched as her dark hair fell to the ground in clumps, leaving her scalp exposed and vulnerable. Each prisoner was issued a uniform, a thin striped dress made of rough fabric that provided almost no warmth or protection. These uniforms were often ill-fitting, either too large or too small, and they wore out quickly under the harsh conditions. The prisoners also received wooden clogs that were extremely uncomfortable and fell apart easily. Many women developed severe blisters and foot injuries from these inadequate shoes, injuries that could become infected and life-threatening in the unsanitary camp conditions. Gerda was assigned a number that was sewn onto her uniform. From that moment on, guards referred to her only by this number, never by her name. This was part of the systematic dehumanization. The Nazis did not want to think of the prisoners as individual human beings with names and stories. They were merely numbers, units of labor to be exploited, until they could work no more. The barracks where the prisoners lived were long, wooden structures, with no insulation and minimal heating. Inside, the women slept on multi-tiered wooden bunks, with no mattresses, pillows, or blankets. In winter, the cold was unbearable. Women huddled together for warmth, but many still suffered from frostbite and hypothermia. In summer, the barracks became stifling and airless, breeding grounds for disease. Each bunk was supposed to accommodate one person, but overcrowding meant that often 2 or even 3 women had to share a single sleeping space. There was no privacy, no personal space. The women lived on top of each other, in conditions that would have been considered inhumane for animals. The sanitary facilities were grotesque. There were communal latrines, open pits or rough wooden structures with holes cut in benches. There was no privacy and no dignity. Women suffering from dysentery and other diseases had to use these facilities while guards watched and sometimes mocked them. Toilet paper did not exist. Prisoners used whatever scraps of cloth or paper they could find. Washing facilities were equally inadequate. There was a communal washing area with cold water and no soap. The women were given only minutes to wash, and the water was often contaminated. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and countless other illnesses ravaged the camp population. The food provided to the prisoners was deliberately insufficient to sustain human life. This was Nazi policy. Work the prisoners as hard as possible, while feeding them as little as possible. The goal was to extract maximum labor before the prisoners died of starvation or exhaustion. Breakfast consisted of a thin, watery liquid that the Nazis called coffee, though it bore no resemblance to actual coffee. It was usually made from roasted grain or acorns and provided minimal nutritional value. Sometimes the women received a small piece of bread, perhaps 100 grams of dark, heavy bread that was often moldy or mixed with sawdust to extend the supply. The midday meal was a watery soup, usually made from turnips or other cheap vegetables. Sometimes there were tiny pieces of potato, or, very rarely, a trace of meat that was likely from diseased animals. The soup was thin and provided few calories. Prisoners fought over the bottom of the soup pot, where any solid material settled, because those few vegetable pieces could mean the difference between life and death. The evening meal was typically the same as breakfast, a piece of bread and ersatz coffee. The total daily caloric intake for prisoners was between 700 and 1,000 calories, while they were forced to perform hard physical labor that burned 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day. This negative caloric balance meant that prisoners were literally starving to death while working. Gerda and the other women became obsessed with food. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence that dominated their thoughts. They dreamed about food, talked about food, remembered meals from their former lives in excruciating detail. The hunger was not just uncomfortable, it was painful, debilitating, and all-consuming. Their bodies began to consume themselves, breaking down muscle and fat reserves in a desperate attempt to survive. The physical changes wrought by starvation were horrific. The women's bodies became skeletal. Their ribs protruded sharply. Their faces became gaunt, with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks. Their skin stretched tight over bones and took on a greyish, unhealthy colour. Their hair, what little grew back after being shaved, became thin and brittle. Their teeth loosened. Their menstrual cycles stopped. The body's response to severe malnutrition. Work began before dawn. The prisoners were awakened by shouting guards and barking dogs, sometimes by physical blows if they didn't move quickly enough. They had only minutes to use the latrines and consume their meagre breakfast before being assembled for roll call. Roll call, or appel, was a daily torture. The prisoners had to stand in precise rows in the camp yard, regardless of weather conditions, while guards counted and recounted them. This process could take hours, especially if the count didn't match the records, or if guards decided to use the occasion for punishment or entertainment. Women stood in rain, snow, and freezing cold, wearing only their thin uniforms, while guards took their time. Those who collapsed from cold or exhaustion were beaten or shot. After roll call, the prisoners were marched to the factories where they worked. Gerda was assigned to a textile factory, ironically, the same industry her father had worked in during peacetime. But there was nothing familiar or comforting about this work. The factory was a place of noise, danger, and exhaustion. The women worked 12 to 14 hours per day, sometimes longer. They operated heavy machinery with minimal training and no safety equipment. Injuries were common. Fingers crushed in machines, burns from hot equipment, cuts from sharp tools. The guards and civilian supervisors showed no concern for worker safety. An injured prisoner who could no longer work was simply replaced. The work was monotonous and exhausting. Gerda stood at her station hour after hour, repeating the same motions thousands of times. The machines were loud, making communication impossible. The air was filled with lint and dust that the women breathed in constantly, leading to respiratory problems. In winter, the factories were barely heated. In summer, they were suffocatingly hot. The guards and supervisors constantly pushed the prisoners to work faster. They screamed orders, delivered blows for perceived laziness, and set impossible quotas that could never be met. The atmosphere was one of constant fear and tension. Any mistake, any perceived slacking, could result in savage punishment. Punishments in the camp were brutal and arbitrary. Guards beat prisoners with clubs, whips, or whatever was at hand. Women were forced to stand for hours in painful positions, to do endless physical exercises, or to perform degrading tasks. Some were locked in isolation cells with no light, food, or water. Others were subjected to public whippings that the entire camp was forced to witness. The guards seemed to take pleasure in cruelty. They would create situations designed to humiliate and degrade the prisoners. They forced women to sing while they worked, to dance for their amusement, to fight each other for scraps of food. They used sexual humiliation as a weapon, making crude comments and sometimes subjecting prisoners to sexual assault. Death was a constant presence in the camp. Women died from starvation, from disease, from exhaustion, from the brutal punishments. Each morning, there were bodies in the barracks. Women who had died during the night. Their corpses were removed without ceremony and taken to be burned or buried in mass graves. The Nazis kept meticulous records of who died, but the deaths themselves were treated as routine administrative matters. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. The prisoners lived in a state of constant terror, never knowing if they would survive another day. They were cut off from the outside world, with no news of their families, no idea how the war was progressing, no hope of rescue. Many fell into deep depression, a state the prisoners called giving up. Once a woman gave up, she usually died within days or weeks. But amid this horror, the women found ways to maintain their humanity. They formed friendships and support networks. They shared their meager food with those who were weaker. They told stories, sang quietly when guards weren't listening, and tried to comfort each other. These small acts of kindness and solidarity were acts of resistance against the Nazi attempt to reduce them to animals. Gerda found strength in her mother's last words, "Be strong." She held on to her identity, reminding herself that she was Gerda Weissmann, daughter of Julius and Helene, sister of Arthur. She was not just a number. She had a name, a history, a family. Even though they were gone, their memory lived in her, and as long as she lived, they were not completely erased. Gerda was moved between several camps during her years as a slave laborer. Each move meant disruption, new guards to fear, new prisoners to befriend. She worked at Marsdorf, at Landeshut, at Grünberg. The conditions varied slightly from camp to camp, but the fundamental reality remained the same. Brutal work, starvation rations, constant fear, and death all around. She witnessed terrible things. She saw women beaten to death for minor infractions. She saw selections where the sick and weak were taken away to be killed. She saw her fellow prisoners transform from healthy young women into walking skeletons. She saw people lose their minds, their bodies continuing to function even as their spirits broke completely. But she also witnessed extraordinary courage and compassion. She saw women share their last piece of bread with someone weaker. She saw prisoners risk punishment to help others. She saw humanity persist even in conditions designed to destroy it. By 1945, Gerda had survived 3 years of slave labor. She was emaciated, sick, and exhausted, but she was still alive. And then, in January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced from the east, the Nazis began evacuating the camps. What awaited Gerda next would test her survival even more severely than the camps had. The death march was about to begin. In January 1945, the Soviet Red Army was advancing rapidly through Poland, pushing the German forces back toward the Reich. The Nazi leadership, desperate to prevent their crimes from being discovered and unwilling to leave potential witnesses alive, ordered the evacuation of concentration and labor camps in the east. These evacuations became known as death marches, forced marches of prisoners through the brutal European winter, journeys that would kill tens of thousands. On January the 29th, 1945, Gerda, and approximately 4,000 other Jewish women were ordered to evacuate the Grünberg labor camp in Lower Silesia. They were given almost no notice and no time to prepare. The guards simply appeared at the barracks and shouted orders. Everyone capable of walking would march west, away from the advancing Soviet forces, deeper into Germany. The timing could not have been worse. January 1945 was one of the coldest winters on record in Central Europe. Temperatures regularly dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Snow covered the ground in thick layers, and bitter winds made the cold even more unbearable. These were conditions that would challenge even well-fed, properly clothed people. For the starving, weakened camp prisoners, they were potentially lethal. The women were given no winter clothing. They wore the same thin, striped camp dresses they had been wearing all along. Garments designed for indoor factory work, not outdoor winter travel. Some women tried to layer whatever scraps of cloth they could find, wrapping themselves in torn blankets or pieces of fabric, but most had nothing beyond their threadbare uniforms. Their footwear was grotesquely inadequate. Most of the women wore wooden clogs, simple blocks of wood with leather or fabric straps. These clogs provided no insulation against the cold and no real support for walking. They were uncomfortable even for short distances, and they fell apart quickly under the strain of constant marching. Many women's clogs broke within the first days, leaving them to walk on bare feet or feet wrapped only in rags. The prisoners were given minimal provisions for the journey. Each woman received perhaps a small piece of bread and was told this would have to sustain her until they reached their destination, though no one told them what that destination was or how long the journey would take. There was no plan for regular food distribution, no supply chain to feed thousands of marching prisoners. The Nazis simply assumed most would die along the way. The march began in the early morning darkness. The 4,000 women were formed into columns and ordered to start walking. SS guards, many of them women, surrounded the column on all sides. They carried rifles and were accompanied by German shepherd dogs trained to attack on command. The guards made it clear from the beginning: anyone who fell behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. Anyone who sat down to rest would be shot. The pace was brutal from the start. The guards forced the women to walk quickly, faster than their weakened bodies could sustain for long. They had to maintain formation and keep moving regardless of exhaustion, pain, or illness. The column stretched for miles along the snow-covered roads of Silesia, a long line of skeletal figures in striped dresses trudging through the winter landscape. Within hours, women began to fall. Some collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies simply giving out after years of starvation and abuse. Others fell because their wooden clogs broke or came off, and they could not continue walking on frozen ground with bare feet. Still others stumbled and fell and weakened beyond recovery, could not get back up. The guards' response was immediate and merciless. When a woman fell, a guard would approach, often without breaking stride, and shoot her in the head or back. Sometimes they used their rifles. Other times they used pistols for close-range executions. The sound of gunfire became a constant companion to the march, a regular punctuation to the shuffle of thousands of feet on snow. The bodies were left where they fell. The Nazis made no effort to bury the dead, or even move them off the road. The marching column simply walked past the corpses of their former companions, stepping around or sometimes over the bodies. The roadside became lined with the dead, a trail of bodies marking the march's progress. Gerda watched women she had known for years shot and killed. She saw friends fall and heard the gunshot that ended their lives. She saw the terror in women's eyes as they felt their strength failing, knowing that to fall meant death. The psychological trauma of witnessing these constant killings, of knowing she could be next at any moment, was almost as unbearable as the physical suffering. The cold was agonizing. The women's thin dresses provided no protection against the winter wind. Their exposed skin, hands, faces, legs, suffered immediate frostbite. Their fingers and toes turned white, then blue, then black as tissue froze and died. Many women lost fingers and toes to frostbite during the march, the frozen digits simply falling off. At night, there was rarely any real shelter. Sometimes the guards would herd the prisoners into a barn or abandoned building where they could lie down for a few hours. More often, they simply stopped on the roadside, and the women had to sleep in the snow. They huddled together for warmth, pressing their bodies against each other in a desperate attempt to conserve heat. Many women who fell asleep never woke up, dying of hypothermia during the night. The guards had heated barns or commandeered houses where they could sleep in relative comfort. They had warm clothing, boots, and adequate food. They rode in trucks for parts of the journey while the prisoners walked every step. The contrast between the guards' conditions and the prisoners' suffering was stark and deliberate. Food was almost non-existent. Days would pass with nothing to eat at all. Occasionally, the guards would distribute small amounts of bread or, very rarely, soup. But these distributions were irregular and inadequate. The women were already starving when the march began, and the combination of constant physical exertion and no food accelerated their starvation. The prisoners resorted to desperate measures to survive. They ate snow to quench their thirst, though this lowered their body temperature dangerously. They scavenged for anything edible: frozen turnips left in fields, scraps of food discarded by the guards, grass, bark, anything. Some women became so desperate they tried to eat their leather shoe straps or pieces of fabric. Disease spread rapidly through the marching column. Typhus, which had been present in the camps, became epidemic during the march. The disease caused high fevers, delirium, and often death. Women suffering from typhus continued to march because stopping meant being shot, walking in fever-induced confusion until they collapsed. Dysentery was equally prevalent. The unsanitary conditions, contaminated water, and starvation diet caused severe intestinal illness. Women suffered from constant painful diarrhea, but had no opportunity to properly relieve themselves. They had to continue marching while soiling themselves, adding humiliation to their physical misery. The dysentery weakened them further and caused severe dehydration. The guards showed no mercy for illness. Women burning with fever were expected to march at the same pace as everyone else. Those who vomited or collapsed from disease were shot just as quickly as those who collapsed from exhaustion. The Nazis saw the prisoners as completely disposable. Their lives had no value whatsoever. Gerda's feet were in terrible condition within the first week. Her wooden clogs had broken, and she wrapped her feet in rags torn from her clothing. But these rags provided minimal protection. Her feet were bleeding, covered in blisters and open sores. Every step was painful. The frozen ground cut into her feet through the thin rags. She developed frostbite on her toes, but Gerda kept walking. She repeated her mother's words to herself like a mantra. Be strong. She thought about her father, her mother, her brother. She told herself that if she died, there would be no one left to remember them. This sense of obligation, to bear witness, to survive so her family would not be completely erased, gave her a reason to take the next step, and then the next. During the march, Gerda formed a crucial friendship with another prisoner named Ilse. The two women had known each other in the labor camps, but their bond deepened during the death march. They made a pact. They would survive together. They would help each other, support each other, and refuse to let each other give up. This friendship became essential to both women's survival. When Gerda was too weak to continue, Ilse would support her, practically carrying her. When Ilse became desperately ill with typhus and could barely walk, Gerda helped her, encouraging her, keeping her moving. They shared what little food they found. They huddled together for warmth at night. They talked to each other, reminding each other of their humanity, of their names and identities. The death toll was staggering. Of the approximately 4,000 women who began the march from Grünberg, fewer than 200 would survive. The journey, which lasted from late January through early May 1945, more than 3 months, covered over 1,000 miles through Silesia, Saxony, and Czechoslovakia. The prisoners walked in a meandering route that seemed to have no clear destination, as the Nazis simply moved them away from Allied forces. The march passed through German towns and villages. Civilian residents could see the column of skeletal women in striped dresses walking through the snow. They could see the guards shooting stragglers and leaving bodies on the roadside. Some civilians looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others watched with curiosity or indifference. A very few showed compassion, secretly leaving food where prisoners might find it, though this was extremely dangerous for both the giver and receiver. As winter turned to spring, the conditions changed slightly, but remained brutal. The snow melted, but this created new problems. The roads turned to mud that was exhausting to walk through. Rain soaked the prisoners' clothing and they had no way to dry off, leading to pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses. The warming weather brought some relief from the cold, but also increased disease transmission. By April 1945, the situation for Nazi Germany was desperate. Allied forces were advancing from both east and west. The Third Reich was collapsing. But the death march continued. The guards, following orders, or perhaps not knowing what else to do, kept the prisoners moving even as the war was clearly ending. Gerda and the other survivors were walking corpses. They weighed less than 70 pounds, their bodies reduced to skin stretched over skeletons. They were covered in lice and sores. They were delirious from fever, exhaustion, and starvation. Many had lost the ability to think clearly, moving forward on pure instinct. In early May 1945, the march reached Volory, a town in Czechoslovakia. By this point, only about 120 women remained alive from the original 4,000. The guards, realizing the war was ending, and perhaps not wanting to be caught in the act of executing prisoners, abandoned the women in an empty bicycle factory on the outskirts of town. The survivors lay on the factory floor, too weak to move, unsure if the guards would return to kill them. They had no food, no water, no medical care. They were dying, barely clinging to life after the 3-month ordeal. Gerda weighed 68 pounds. Ilse was desperately ill with typhus and dysentery. They waited in that factory, suspended between death and an uncertain future, not knowing that liberation was just hours away. They had survived the impossible, the death march that killed 97% of those who began it. But they did not yet know if they had truly survived, or if they would simply die in this abandoned factory, so close to freedom. The date was May 7th, 1945. Liberation was about to arrive. During this nightmare, Gerda formed a profound bond with another prisoner named Ilse. The two women made a pact to survive together, a promise that became their lifeline. when Gerda's wooden clogs disintegrated and her feet became raw and bleeding. Ilse helped her fashion makeshift coverings from scraps of cloth. When Gerda was too weak to walk, delirious with fever and ready to give up, Ilse supported her weight and kept her moving, knowing that stopping meant death. Later, when Ilse contracted typhus and could barely move, her body burning with fever, Gerda returned the gift of survival. She helped carry Ilse through snow and ice, sharing what little food they found, and talking to her through the night to keep her conscious. They took turns being strong when the other faltered. This friendship, forged in the worst circumstances imaginable, became one of the slim threads that kept both women tethered to life when death would have been easier. By May 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed and the Third Reich crumbled under Allied advances, the SS guards who had driven the death march began to panic. They had marched the surviving prisoners to an abandoned textile factory in Volory, a small town in Czechoslovakia near the German border. The factory was a hollow shell of a building, its machinery long since removed, its windows broken. Inside, the survivors were skeletal figures ravaged by typhus and dysentery, their bodies reduced to skin stretched over bone. They were barely conscious, lying scattered across the cold factory floor, unable to stand or walk. The smell of death permeated the air. Gerda weighed 68 pounds, her body so emaciated that every bone was visible. Her hair had been shaved, her skin was covered in sores, and typhus had left her with a raging fever. Many of the women believed the guards would return to execute them. This fear haunted their final hours of captivity, that after surviving the unimaginable horrors of the camps and the death march, they would be murdered at the last moment. Some were too sick to care anymore, drifting in and out of consciousness. Others, including Gerda, clung to a thread of hope so thin it was almost invisible, but it was there nonetheless. On May 7th, 1945, just one day before Germany's official surrender, American forces from the 5th Infantry Division reached Volory. A young American soldier named Kurt Klein, a lieutenant who served as an intelligence officer, was among the troops. Klein was himself a German-born Jew who had escaped Nazi Germany in 1937 at the age of 17, coming to America with his family just before the borders closed. His parents had remained behind and perished in the Holocaust. Klein spoke fluent German and had been assisting in the liberation of concentration camps, translating for American forces and helping to identify survivors. When Klein opened the heavy factory door, he was confronted with a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The interior was dim, illuminated only by weak daylight filtering through broken windows. Dozens of women lay on the floor in various states of consciousness. The stench was overwhelming. The smell of unwashed bodies, disease, death, and human waste. Some of the women were already dead. Others were so close to death that they couldn't respond to his presence. Klein stood in the doorway, momentarily paralyzed by the horror before him. Then, from the depths of the factory, one figure stirred. Gerda Weissmann, summoning strength from somewhere deep within, a reserve she didn't know she possessed, managed to push herself up from the floor. Her wooden clogs, which had somehow remained on her feet through the entire march, scraped against the concrete as she stood on trembling legs. She was dizzy, her vision blurred, her body screaming in protest, but she forced herself to remain upright. She wanted to meet her liberator standing, with whatever dignity she could still claim. She looked at this young American soldier in his clean uniform, so impossibly healthy and strong, and she spoke to him in English. a language she had learned in school years ago in another lifetime. Her voice was barely above a whisper, cracked and weak from months of near silence and dehydration. "We are Jewish, you know," she said, identifying herself and the others. It was important to her that he understand who they were, that they were human beings, not just the broken remnants he saw before him. Klein, moved beyond words by what he witnessed, and by this woman's courage to stand and speak, responded in a gentle voice, "So am I." His eyes filled with tears. He understood immediately what these women had endured. He saw in them echoes of his own family, his own parents who had died in camps, just like the ones these women had survived. Then Klein did something that Gerda would remember for the rest of her life, something that began to restore her humanity after years of dehumanization. He asked, with profound respect, if he could see the other ladies, using that word, ladies, addressing them with a dignity and courtesy they had not experienced in years. In the camps and on the death march, they had been called animals, vermin, numbers. They had been stripped of their names, their identities, their humanity. This simple act of treating them as human beings, as women deserving of respect, broke something open inside Gerda. Later, she would say that this was the moment she truly began to believe she might survive, that she might return to being human again. Klein immediately called for medical assistance and additional troops. The women needed urgent medical care. Most were suffering from typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and severe malnutrition. Klein stayed with them, speaking gently in German, trying to comfort them, promising them they were safe now. Some of the women were too sick to understand what was happening. Others wept, unable to believe their ordeal was finally over. Klein arranged for the women to be transported to a field hospital that American forces had established nearby. The medical staff worked desperately to save as many survivors as possible, but for some, liberation had come too late. Their bodies, pushed beyond all limits of human endurance, simply could not recover. Even with medical care, food, and safety, some of the women died in the days and weeks following their liberation. Each death was a tragedy. To have survived so much, only to die after freedom had finally come. But Gerda survived. Her body, though devastated, possessed a stubborn will to live. The doctors treated her typhus, slowly introduced food to her starved system, and cleaned and dressed her wounds. The process of physical recovery was long and painful. Her digestive system had to relearn how to process food. Her body had to rebuild muscle and tissue. Her immune system had to fight off the diseases that ravaged her. For weeks, she drifted between consciousness and fever dreams, her mind unable to fully grasp that the nightmare had ended. Ilse, too, recovered. The bond between the two women remained strong through their recovery. They had saved each other's lives on the death march, and now they supported each other through the slow process of healing and confronting what came next. The devastating realization that they were among the few survivors, that their families were gone, that the world they had known before the war had been utterly destroyed. During Gerda's recovery, Kurt Klein visited her regularly. He was drawn to this remarkable woman who had stood to greet him in that factory, who had maintained her dignity and humanity through the worst circumstances imaginable. He would sit by her bedside and talk to her, telling her about America, about his own escape from Germany, about the life that was possible beyond the horror they had both witnessed. Gerda found herself looking forward to his visits. His presence represented hope, a future, the possibility that life could be more than survival. Klein saw in Gerda not just a survivor, but a woman of extraordinary strength, intelligence, and spirit. Despite everything she had endured, there was a light in her eyes that had not been extinguished. She spoke thoughtfully about her experiences, about her family, about the life she had lost. She had not become bitter or broken. She carried her trauma, but she was not defined solely by it. As Gerda's health improved, Klein was transferred to another location. Before he left, he asked if he could write to her. Gerda agreed, and thus began a correspondence that would change both their lives. Klein wrote to her regularly, long letters filled with thoughts, observations, and gradually growing affection. Gerda wrote back, her letters revealing more of herself, her hopes, her grief, her slowly developing dreams for a future she had never imagined she would have. The letters continued for 3 years. During this time, Gerda was moved to displaced persons camps where survivors gathered, trying to rebuild their lives and search for any remaining family members. Gerda searched desperately for information about her parents and brother, hoping against hope that somehow they had survived. Eventually, she received confirmation of what she had feared. Her entire family had perished. Her parents had been murdered at Auschwitz. Her brother Arthur had died in a concentration camp. She was the sole survivor of her family. This knowledge was devastating, yet Gerda found the strength to continue. She learned new skills, began working, and slowly, painfully, started to envision a future. Klein's letters were a lifeline during this period, reminding her that connection and love were still possible, that life could hold joy again. In 1946, Klein managed to bring Gerda to America. The immigration process was complex and bureaucratic, but Klein navigated it with determination. When Gerda arrived in New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty, she wept. Tears of grief for all she had lost, tears of relief at reaching safety, tears of gratitude for this second chance at life. Klein was waiting for her when she arrived. Their relationship, which had been sustained through letters, deepened in person. They courted in the traditional sense, going to dinners, taking walks, attending concerts, all the normal activities that had been denied to Gerda during her youth. Klein was patient, understanding, and deeply loving. He understood her trauma and her grief, and he gave her space to heal while also showing her that happiness was possible. 3 years after their first meeting in that factory in Volari, in June 1946, Kurt Klein and Gerda Weissmann married in Paris in a small ceremony. Gerda wore a simple white dress. The wedding was bittersweet, a celebration of love and new beginnings, but also a reminder of all the people who should have been there but weren't. Gerda's parents would never see her marry. Her brother would never walk her down the aisle. But in their absence, Gerda chose to honor their memory by living fully, by embracing this chance at happiness. The couple moved to Buffalo, New York, where Klein worked in business, and Gerda began the process of building a home and a life in America. She learned to navigate American culture, perfected her English, and slowly created a new identity that incorporated both who she had been before the war and who she had become through her survival. In 1947, their first child was born, followed by 2 more children in the coming years. Gerda threw herself into motherhood with fierce devotion, giving her children all the love and security that had been stolen from her own youth. But even as she built this new life, Gerda never forgot where she had come from or what she had witnessed. She carried her past with her always, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. She had survived when millions had not, and she felt compelled to ensure their stories were not forgotten.